Hello, and welcome to Between Cross and Crescent. My name is David Ruderman, and it is a pleasure to be with you and to be teaching my second course for the Teaching Company. When I was doing my first course on modern Jewish intellectual history, I was always thinking about this subject, that we needed to go back into an earlier period and try to reconstruct those aspects of Jewish civilization that are relevant to the modern world. And now I have the opportunity, and we are about to launch a new adventure in the study of Jewish history. So I hope you will join me and enjoy the experience that I'm going to try to offer you. What I want to say first has to do with the nature of the study of Jewish history. I actually said something very similar when I began the other course, but for those of you who have never heard this before, it is absolutely essential that I talk about these things. And for those of you who have heard, I bet some of you have forgotten a little bit, so you will not mind my repeating myself, but only for a very short period of time in this first lecture. I also want to speak about the issue of this period, that is the question of periodization. Why this period? What is distinct about this period? What do we call this period? So I will also say something about that before the end of our first lecture today. My first point is that Jewish history, although part of the history of world civilization, and like other histories, particularly national histories, is also unique in one major respect. And that respect has to do with its landlessness. That is, when the Jews, that is, the ancient Israelites, were expelled from Jerusalem in the year 586 before Christ, or 586 before the Common Era, as we usually refer to it, and they went off to Babylonia, many of them never came back. Some of them returned, but most of them remained in Babylonia. And what we have already in this very early period of time is a diaspora, a word which is quite a common word in the English language today, but is usually associated with the experience of the Jews. Similarly, many centuries after, in the year 70 AD or CE, when the Romans conquered Jerusalem, destroyed it, and forced the Jews to leave, many Jews moved throughout the Middle East. They went farther into Europe and across North Africa. And again, they reimpose themselves within a diaspora setting. So what we have here is this most uncommon and also fascinating aspect of Jewish history, namely a living community of Jews living all around the world, the inhabitable world, both within the Islamic world, as we will see later on, the Christian world, living in every land in addition to the land of Israel. And the question, of course, is, without a common government, without a common language, without a common land, do these Jews have a singular, unified history? Land, of course, is obvious. Diaspora means Jews are living all over the place. Common government, sometimes they live under monarchy, sometimes they live under more democratic settings. One king rules them oppressively, one king rules them more benignly, but clearly they're living under different governmental structures. And what about language? Jews, of course, adopt the languages of their land. As we will see in this course, Jews spoke and wrote in Arabic. Or they spoke French, or German, or Italian, or Russian, or Polish, and so on. They did know Hebrew as well, some of them, but not all of them. All of these different language structures, how do we speak about a common historical experience? Or to put it another way, is there really a commonality between the united monarchy of ancient Israel, here I'm speaking about the biblical period, for example, with a contemporary American Jewish community living in the United States of America? Do Jews living in America in the 21st century actually have anything in common with Saul and David and Solomon and all of those Israelites that we read about in the Old Testament in the Hebrew Bible? That is a real question. So the issue, is there one culture of the Jews, is a question that every historian studying this period has to raise. Let me give you a recent example of this. In a textbook that just appeared, which I've actually been using at my courses at the University of Pennsylvania. The book is entitled Cultures of the Jews, and is written by about 15 different historians, beginning in the ancient period all the way to the present. Very interesting and intriguing title. Not culture of the Jews, the cultures of the Jews. So we have ancient culture, we have Hellenistic culture, we have Judeo-Islamic culture, we have European Latin culture, and all of them are creating hopefully a commonality, but at the same time they are disparate. And perhaps the pressure on the editor was such to use the word cultures. And that is a good illustration of the kind of tension that I'm speaking about. However, having said that, let us point out the obvious. That although the problem of spatial and temporal discontinuities is real and exists, when you look at the Jews themselves, and particularly at their own self-consciousness, the way they define themselves, their own self-definition, Jews saw themselves as one people. Not many peoples, not many cultures, but one culture and one people. They acted corporately and were acted upon corporately. For example, in the Middle Ages, whether we're speaking about the Islamic world or the Christian world, Jews were more or less a legal corporate group, governing themselves by their own divine laws, buttressed by the secular powers to be. Very interesting description of them. God says we should observe the laws of the land. In other words, the king gives us the laws, or God gives us the laws, and the king says it reinforces that authority. In other words, allows us to live as our own little communal structure. And therefore, we live under both the blessing of God, so to speak, and the secular authority. That common situation exists both in the Islamic world, as we will see, and also in the Christian world. Only in the modern times do Jews acquire regular citizenship, and they have to give up, of course, their corporate rights and disabilities. That sub-community of Jews, that community within the larger community, disappears with the rise of French nationalism, for example, or English nationalism, and so on. In other words, in the modern era, the corporate phenomenon of Jewish life is less visible. Nevertheless, throughout the entire pre-modern world, and that certainly includes everything in this course, we are speaking about a unified culture where a Jew who is living in North Africa, if he were to travel to Europe or to Russia or to another part of the Middle East or wherever he went and walked into a synagogue, he would recognize the liturgy, he would recognize the prayers, he would recognize the culture, the holidays, the customs, he would know what the birth rituals are, he would know what the funeral customs are. He would feel a common bond and affiliation with Jews, even though he was crossing the boundaries from the Islamic to the Christian world or vice versa. In other words, there was an awareness on the part of these individual Jews that they were part of a community, despite the fact that we historians may not look at this as, and we may use the word cultures instead of describing only one culture. To explain this, therefore, is to evoke the sense of a nature of a Jewish religious affiliation, which was all-embracing. Jews could move from culture, from land to land, from nation to nation, but they took their own religious apparatus. They took their rituals, they took their beliefs, they took their customs, and they brought them, and they lived within a structure which identified themselves not only with their immediate community, but with Jewish communities around the world. In more recent times, of course, that sense of group consciousness and religious affiliation is less apparent. It has diminished over time. We use the words acculturation or assimilation to describe this phenomenon. But clearly, if one looks at this longue durée, this long period of Jewish cultural development over hundreds of thousands of years, we are speaking about something of a very deep cultural memory, a deep awareness of living within an experience which is unitary despite the historical problems that we have pointed out. My next point has to do with the way one studies Jewish history. And here For me, having done this already 35 years in the university, it's pretty commonplace. But I want to put it on the table as well. That is, Jewish history is one of adaptation and synthesis with a larger culture in which Jews lived. That means that Jewish history cannot be studied in isolation. Jews have tended to study their history as if it is just a part of a curriculum of Jewish studies. But one of the most extraordinary things in the recent 30, 40, 50 years is how Jewish studies have been integrated into a university curriculum. And clearly, the fact that I'm a member of a history department at the University of Pennsylvania, for example, empowers me to see Jewish history not only in its own terms, but within the context of Western civilization and world civilizations as a whole. So that means that if I were to teach the Bible, it needs to be studied in relationship to the ancient Near East. Medieval Jewish thought, as we will see in our course, needs to be studied as part of Islamic and Christian thought. Zionism, if we were studying Zionism in the modern era, would need to be a part of the history of modern nationalisms. Now that may be self-evident to many of you, but I want to again put it on the table. I think it is important that we see our course and our own perspective from the point of view of its cross-cultural interaction with the larger worlds around them. That's what our author meant by cultures of the Jews. That Jews were both Jewish and they were also part of an Islamic culture or of a Latin culture and so on and so forth. Now, if one studies the history of the discipline of Jewish history, that is Jewish historiography, one encounters immediately several approaches which have been taken to our subject. And I was sort of alluding to this when I said it may be obvious to you that we have to study Jewish culture cross-culturally, but it wasn't so obvious to people that were involved in this discipline in previous generations. I wanted now to speak about three approaches to the study of Jewish history, and to point out that they were significant historically, and they added much to the subject, but all of them are limited and flawed and cannot necessarily be used by us in teaching Jewish history. The first approach I want to call the Jewish traditional approach, which incorporates already some very basic assumptions inherent in the Jewish religious tradition. This approach assumes that Jewish history, or history in general, is linear. That is, straightforward. It develops as a kind of divine drama, the story unfolding between God and His chosen people, culminating, of course, in the denouement of history, that is, the Messianic era. In other words, Jewish history from a religious, traditional point of view is the history of the dialogue, or of the covenantal relationship between God and His chosen people as they emerge over time. How the Jews were obedient and attentive to God's words, and thus they were rewarded, and how when they were disobedient and turned away from God, they were punished. Punished usually by being expelled from their land, and thus the diaspora, or what is called in traditional Jewish language, galut, or exile. Exile, on the one hand, the punishment of God if the Jews are not behaving properly, and ultimately His turning His face towards them and redeeming them, redemption. In Hebrew, the words are galut v'geula, exile and redemption. They are part, again, of a traditional view which we can already find in the Bible itself, in describing the covenantal relationship in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, between God and the Jewish people. Events occur, obviously, then under this rubric because they are performed by the will of God. The Bible, from this perspective, and this is something that the traditional Christians also share, the Bible is of divine authorship. The exile, as we said, is a condition caused by the Jewish people breaking the covenant, which will be overcome only when God sends His Messiah. And the notion of exile implies not only a physical banishment from the land, but also God turning His face, so to speak, from the Jewish people and punishing them, and ultimately He will return back to them when they are redeemed. Now, this is a theological view, which, as I said, is implicit in the Bible itself, but it has also dominated for centuries the way traditional Jews have seen their history. History, therefore, from the perspective of the medieval historian, is a history of those who lived during the Bible period, during the period when the rabbis lived and wrote their rabbinic texts. In other words, everything is from the perspective of the relationship between God and the Jewish people. And ultimately, of course, it is straight, as we said, and ultimately, of course, it means the redemption, the ingathering of the exile, and the Messianic era coming together. If we can define a Jewish traditional view, let us also try to define a Christian theological approach to the study of Jewish history. I want to be equal-handed here. Jewish history is seen from a traditional Christian perspective as a kind of prehistory of Christianity. What I mean by that is that by the year 70 AD or CE or 136 is the destruction of the final Jewish community in Palestine, the final Roman revolt which was defeated. Jews were expelled, Israel was conquered by Rome, and so on. In other words, the period that follows Jesus' death and also the creation of the first Christian communities. At this point, Jewish history more or less ends from a Christian perspective. In other words, Jews don't really have, at least for interest to Christians, a real political and cultural history. Jewish history ends with the rise of the Catholic Church, and this, of course, is the result of the rejection of Jesus by the rabbis, by the Jews themselves. We will define in another lecture the Pharisees, who they were, and so on, and the later rabbis. In other words, Jewish history is interesting as a prelude to Christianity. Jews are once the chosen people. They gave up their mantle of chosenness when the church assumed the right path, and the Jews continued stubbornly and awkwardly to go down their wrong path. Because the church is the true Israel, what happens to Jews after the rise of Christianity is thus insignificant and not worthy of study. Now, you may say this is too harsh. I mean, do people actually do that? But I must tell you, an essay written by the historian at Stanford, Gavin Langmuir, in the 1960s, when I was actually in graduate school, actually did a survey of, at that time, current Western historical texts of European history, world history, and so on. And indeed, in these textbooks, what you get is Jews appear in the biblical period, then they disappear. Maybe you have a usurer, a moneylender walking around in the Middle Ages, here and there, a little anti-Semitism maybe occasionally. And then you have the Holocaust, and sometimes the rise of the State of Israel, and nothing in between. In other words, Jewish history pales in significance. It's not a conscious part. Now, things have changed, let me tell you. Because of Jewish historical studies within university, textbooks have been rewritten, and not only other silent areas of history like the Jews are now included. There are an awful lot of fields that were left out that now have gained our attention and have entered the consciousness of the study of the historical past. But at least up until the 1960s, secular textbooks, I'm not speaking here about theologians or theological perspectives, actually kept this perspective on Christian history even when these people were secularized themselves. In other words, Jewish history was not a significant field of interest to most historians who study the history of the West. So let us call that the Christian theological approach and its secular residue, perhaps, as we enter the modern period. A third approach emerges in the 19th century among scholars like a man called Heinrich Graetz, who was the great historian of world Jewry in the 19th century. He was a German Jew who wrote a multi-history of the Jews, and others, who were discovering for the first time the scholarly groundings of Judaism. In other words, they were trying to create a field called the academic study of Judaism. For Graetz, Jewish history was primarily a history of Jewish ideas. He was primarily an intellectual historian. So therefore, social history, economic history had very little interest to him. But also, the other aspect of his history was a history of Jewish suffering. His role as a Jewish historian was to tell the world how they mistreated the Jews. And therefore, either suffering or ideas or the immorality of the way non-Jews have treated the Jews is the major leitmotif of Grätz's history. His history was therefore clearly apologetic, attempting to show how Jews were entitled to full citizenship, that their culture was really up to date and particularly was rational. In other words, to prove that they belonged in Western culture, they needed to have a rational, not an irrational culture. So therefore, when Grätz got to the subject of the Kabbalah, that is Jewish mysticism, he stuck it under the carpet. He was embarrassed by it. He wouldn't talk about it. He made fun of it. He mocked it. And therefore, his history is filled with apologetic overtones. He was clearly, on the one hand, looking at the past, but at the same time, he was looking at the present situation of Jews who required citizenship, who required to be part of the larger cultural world. And therefore, the origins of modern historical scholarship written by Jews in the 19th century is extremely apologetic. Obviously, if we take these three approaches, the traditional Jewish approach, the traditional Christian approach, the 19th century apologetic, scholarly approach, we find that they're all quite limited, and that a meaningful approach to the study of Jewish history in our course has to somehow overcome the biases of these three approaches. Divine causality, no matter how pious I or anybody else may be, does not offer, at least in the framework of our course, the key to understanding how individuals, peoples, and institutions behave. Jewish history shares a common methodology with other histories. I must admit that Jewish history is not science. History is not science. I know that after doing it for many years. I certainly bring my own prejudices to the subject because there is no such thing as objective history. The fact that we choose to study certain histories has an awful lot to do with our own autobiography. I can tell you after doing this and in hearing it from my students that I have a certain perspective on the past which is shaped by the world I live in the present. But at least I attempt to be self-conscious about my own prejudices and strive to be as objective and honest in viewing the past as I can. That's the best I can attempt in this course. But at least that kind of self-consciousness is critical here. Now, those remarks I had inserted in my previous course. So up to this point, you're getting a repeat. I bet it sounds different after 3 years. It couldn't be the same thing. But nevertheless, that was what I would begin any Jewish history course with. Now, in the remaining time in this lecture, I want to focus on a few questions about the specific period that we're going to be covering in this course. The subtitle is From Mohammed to Spinoza. That is roughly 7th century to 17th century. 10 centuries, only 10 centuries in 24 half hours. Easy as pie. Now, usually when you talk about this period from a general Western historical perspective, we would use the word medieval, and perhaps we'd also use the word early modern because, you can't talk about the 17th century as being medieval. In the past, of course, some historians have done so, particularly in terms of Jewish history. What do I mean by these terms, which are basically conventional usages? And in many respects, they are very ambiguous. Let me just point out the problem of using these two terms, even though I'm going to use them anyway. I mean, I have no better terms to use. When studying both the Muslim and Christian civilizations, does the word Middle Ages or medieval actually apply? In other words, the medieval period, as some of you may know, was a construction of historians who saw world history exclusively through the lens of Christian civilization in Europe. In other words, the medieval period was in contrast to an earlier ancient classical period and, of course, a modern, or the Renaissance and Reformation, and then the modern period that followed. It is not so clear that Muslim civilization in the centuries following Muhammad's ascendancy can be labeled as medieval. What does that mean? Islam begins in the 7th century. So how can the 8th, 9th, and 10th century be called medieval? It clearly also wasn't a period of decline or of dark ages, another term that is often used to speak about the medieval period. Clearly, if anything, the Muslims in the 8th, 9th, 10th century were not living in a dark age at all. This was a period of great renaissance, of great cultural efflorescence that was going on within their own culture. So we have here a problem of definition. Similarly, when Jews are living both in the Islamic world and in the Christian world, what are we to call them? Are they medieval Jews? I don't have a solution to the problem, but I want to point this out to be a real problem. Also, the term early modern has a very interesting pedigree and an interesting history. It is a term that is now used by most European historians in describing roughly the period that we once called, when I was going to graduate school, the Renaissance or the Reformation. People objected to the Renaissance and Reformation because that meant more or less white males. It didn't really comprise the full culture, the full texture of the civilization that we were describing. So the words Renaissance and Reformation, while they're still around, are used less. And here we have a kind of neutral, politically correct word, early modern. But what does early modern mean? It obviously refers to modern, right? So we have to define modern with respect to early modern. Now, again, I don't have a solution to finding a better word. There is a kind of muddle over the word, a muddling effect this term early modern has. And of course, if we were to introduce the element of Islam, we have a more serious problem. The Muslims who lived in the Ottoman Empire, are they early modern? What does that mean with reference to their own civilization? In Jewish history, and I'm actually working on a book as we speak on this subject, early modernity is a very recent term and has not yet been carefully defined within the historiographical literature. I am in the process of trying to define it, so maybe one day you may see a book on the subject. But by using the term, I want to argue that this period, roughly from the end of the 15th century, 1492, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, you will hear as a major turning point later on in the course. Roughly from that period until 1750, we have a period which is not Middle Ages, not modernity, has its own distinctive characteristics. Some of them have to do with mobility, the movement of populations from west to east, from east to, and some very interesting things going on. It has something to do with knowledge explosion, with the printing press, for example. It has to do with the blurring of cultural and religious boundaries between Jews and Christians and others. I'm going to try to elucidate some of those issues as we get into this course. But I do want to argue already that indeed we will use the word medieval because we have no other better word, but we understand its limitations when describing both the Muslims and Jews living in the Muslim world, and it clearly wasn't a word that they would associate themselves with, or for that matter, the Christian who lived in the so-called Middle Ages. The term early modern describes a world connected to the medieval world, but in many respects is still very, very different. And indeed, it is problematic how to describe it in relationship to modernity. What does the modern period mean? What does the early modern period mean? I'm not sure that I will have easy solutions to that problem. But I want to suggest, in fact, that we separate our course. The first 2/3 of the course will deal first with Jews under Islam, and will take us from Baghdad to Cordova, in particular the two major centers of Jewish life. Then we will turn to the Christian world and look at that side of the emergence of Jewish communities in Western Europe, in Germany, in France, in England, and later on in Eastern Europe. But then at that point, we will break and see that Jews are removed physically from Western Europe with a series of expulsions that begin in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. And slowly but surely, the emergence of Jewish communities in Central and Eastern Europe, in Italy, in the Ottoman Empire, and eventually the return of the Jews to Western Europe by the 16th and 17th century. So that just charting the history of this period, we see that we are dealing with two distinct sections of our course. And therefore, when I describe the course to you, the 2/3 will deal with Jews and Christians and Muslims within quote-unquote medieval culture. And then we will make that shift, and we will see that Jews are moving eastward, but they're also rethinking who they are and defining themselves a bit differently. To mention, for example, when Jews begin to connect with each other through a printed book, when they become aware of Jews living far away because they read their books, there is another element. I suggested already that Jews were living, could be familiar with each other even in the Middle Ages. But in the early modern period, there's something else. But let us summarize by simply saying that these terms of periodization are clearly only limited by how the historian uses them and nothing more. Anyway, let us continue and now jump into the course that we have described.